Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video on the Green Knight. Now, we're doing this video slightly in anticipation of the release of Bretonnia next month, and I think the Green Knight is almost confirmed to be making an appearance in Total War Warhammer. I think there's been promotional images with the Green Knight appearing in it. So he'll definitely be an addition, and I just wanted to give you guys all a bit more information about him. The concept of the Green Knight is one that we have in the real world. It's actually originated from a 14th century Arthurian poem and entitled Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And he's had many iterations since, but always the concept of the Green Knight has often been linked with Arthurian legend. Now, this is very important when considering that essentially Bretonnia is a faction devised by taking Arthurian legend and combining it with the sort of horrors and unfairness of an actual feudal system in the real world, and taking that to its extremes with how much sort of peasantry is taxed and how difficult it must have been for anyone who wasn't a noble during feudal times. Now, the Green Ghost himself is either sort of a demon or a daemon or a ghost, or and if he is a demon, he's a good demon. But there's something very much otherworldly about the Green Knight. He does very much like Grombrindal for the dwarves, often turn up when Bretonnia is most in need of help, and he sort of charges in on his green stallion and slaughters whatever happens to be threatening whichever Bretonnian kingdom at the time. But there is another element to the Green Knight as well, and that has to do with how the Knights of Bretonnia progress their careers. So when you're a young chap starting out, you start off as a squire. You're very much just carrying armor, helping a knight put on his, allowing the knight to teach you the way of the sword, the way of the horse, and it's really a sort of apprenticeship on how to become a knight. Now, after this apprenticeship is over, squires sign up to be knights errant, which are essentially sort of the young bucks of the knighting world. They're a bit hot-headed, charge into things a bit needlessly, get into trouble, perhaps aren't quite as well equipped as their sort of older brethren. But so that's what you do. And once you're an errant knight, you then go on, you progress, you learn your skills, you become a fully fledged Knight of the Realm. Which is sort of the heraldry, the full regalia. Knights of the Realm have actually made an appearance in Total War Warhammer already, and are one of the knightly units that you can already recruit in the game, in multiplayer at least. So Knights of the Realm are just your average knight. Now, once your average knight decides to look for something called the Blessing of the Lady, which very much takes the Arthurian concept of the Lady of the Lake and the Holy Grail and merges those two things together. Legend says that if one drinks from the Holy Grail, it will imbue one with the blessing of the Lady, which will give one immense strength and power, and essentially make any knight who actually gets it kind of almost a demigod, as it were, amongst men. Just hugely strong, hugely powerful, and that can have an aura impact around those sort of even near him. It's that much of a blessing, really. When the Knights of the Realm are like, I want something more, I want to become one of these elite knights, one of these Knights of the Grail, they then have to temporarily, mind you, give up all their worldly possessions and their claims to any titles, and then they go on to become questing knights. Now, questing knights are slightly different on the tabletop, but for the sake of this lore video, let's just say it's the next step up. So these guys are off, they're wandering the lands of Bretonnia, wandering even further afield if need be. They're doing great deeds, slaying monsters, helping those in need, doing all the chivalric things that one would imagine a knight trying to prove himself to the lady would do. Now, the concept is, if the lady, having seen your great deeds, decides that you're maybe worthy, she may grant you a boon and appear in front of you. But that's not where it ends. There's still one more test to go, and that test is indeed the Green Knight. So the Green Knight will appear. He will very much challenge you one-on-one combat. Now, many people have bested the Green Knight in combat, and in fact, he keeps coming back to life. In fact, people have thought they've killed him before. There's even a famous case where someone beheaded the Green Knight only to have the Green Knight pick up his head and thank them very much for the battle, for the fight even. So one gets the impression that although the Green Knight could probably kill any mortal man, that he kind of just fights them to sort of get the cut of their jib, see what they're made of, see what lays at their heart. The Green Knight can maybe sense what kind of a knight you are, what kind of person you are by your method of fighting. I think that's very much the concept. And then if the Green Knight finds you worthy, then the lady can impart her blessing onto the knight who manages to defeat the Green Knight. And the blessing, after you receive the blessing, you'll drink from the grail which the lady will have on her, and you'll become a fully fledged demigod Grail Knight. So really, for these knights, the Green Knight is really just a test of strength, a test of power, and really an arbiter of those who should be deemed worthy to get the lady's blessing. Also acts very much as the lady's protector in legend. Now, for many years, Warhammer fans were free to speculate on exactly who the Green Knight was. It was never really addressed, and that is until the end times. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the end times, but I'm going to go on their answer as to the identity of the Green Knight, because that's what Games Workshop will have in mind, and that's what CA in turn will have in mind when they bring the Green Knight to Total War Warhammer. And that is, the Green Knight was once in his life Giles le Breton. Now, Giles le Breton is essentially Bretonnia's equivalent of Sigmar. He united the country, and he is very much the founding father of Bretonnia as it's known in the Warhammer world today. Now, how did Giles get his start, you may ask? Well, Giles was born heir of the Dukedom of Baston, and now let me get a bit into the history of Bretonnia at the time. So this is around year of the Imperial calendar 977. So around 1,000 years after Sigmar had appeared, and around 1,500 years before the current timeline in Total War Warhammer. So at the time, Bretonnia had evolved from a sort of barbarian tribe, much like the Empire had been at the time of Sigmar, and had sort of settled down into this feudalistic society. They'd never united like the Empire had under Sigmar, and they'd very much kept in fractured dukedoms. So every duke was looking out for themselves. There wasn't a united country known as Bretonnia. Now, this really opened them up to a lot of vulnerability and a lot of attack, because they might be at each other's throats, and then you might have a huge horde of greenskins coming in. And that's exactly what happened. So during the year Imperial calendar 930, Greenskin Horde, underneath the leadership of a goblin called Garabad, began invading the empire, began invading Bretonnia. They could raid, they'd go from dukedom to dukedom, raiding and pillaging. And then also from the forest of Ardennes, which is the forest right next to Mousillon, on the Total War Warhammer map, beastmen hordes started spewing forth all over the countryside. And then on top of that, Surtur the Imperishable, so the Tomb King's leader, I think that is, began sending up hordes of undead to try and conquer lands to the north. So essentially all the dukedoms of Bretonnia are set upon here. They've got huge hordes of greenskins pouring in from the south, huge hordes of undead. Beastmen have suddenly started massing together and forming huge battle hordes and just like tearing the countryside apart. Now, in all of this chaos, you have the newly crowned Duke of Baston, which is Giles le Breton. Now, Le Breton at the time had teamed up with his friends, Duke Tirwulf de Lyonnaise and Landuin de Mousillon. So the Dukes of Mousillon and Lyonnaise and Baston had all teamed together and had formed an army. But they just sort of got cornered by a huge orc war that just outnumbered them by several 100 to 1. They were doomed. Overnight, they encamped by a lake. And by that lake, Le Breton knelt down and started praying for salvation. Just said, please give us strength. Somebody help us in our time of dire need. We are all about to be slaughtered. And then a mist started to settle over the lake he was praying at, and a heavenly beauty of a woman appeared out of these mists. Now, perhaps out of a moment of madness or maybe genius, no one knows, Le Breton held his standard of baston aloft and yelled, "Lady, would thou bless mine banner?" And he dipped his banner, which had been tattered and bloodied and torn in previous skirmishes, into the lake, and he pulled it out, and it emerged clean, renewed, and emblazoned with the sigil of the Holy Grail. Having seen this, all the other sort of lords rushed forward and also cried out for the lady's blessing, dipping their swords, their lances, their helms, anything they could in the lake to grant it sort of renewed strength and vigor. Guy then approached the lady, and she allowed him to sip from the Holy Grail. He was the first to do so. He was then joined by his two friends, the Duke of Lyonesse and the Duke of Moussillon, and they became the first 3 Grail Knights. Morning, the sun is beginning to rise, and everyone, all the Bretonnians, scramble to their horses to ride out for what they still believe might still be their final battle. They've taken very much heart from the appearance of this beautiful heavenly creature that blessed them and renewed their strength and vigor. And they charge headlong into the orc horde, which was so vast it darkened the horizon. Now, having hit the front line of the horde, the whole horde began to crumble, began to sort of shudder and repel, much like a sort of creature being lanced. And they started to falter. And that's when the 3 new Grail Knights started to show their unbelievable new strength. And they just started to cleave through hordes and hordes of greenskins, turning the earth black with their blood. And lo and behold, by the time the sun was setting on that day, as the sun started to take on a pinkish hue, the orc horde broke and scattered, having suffered huge casualties under the Bretonnian strength of arms. They had won the day. So as the ravens and the buzzards began to peck down on the corpses of all the orcs slain, Le Breton and his companions, the Duke of Moussillon and the Duke of Lyonesse, knelt and pledged their fealty to the Lady of the Lake, vowing to be of service to her, and also vowing to each other not to break up their army until the deed of freeing Bretonnia was done. So this is kicked off a crazy campaign, the likes of which has rarely been seen in the old world. So having gone from their victory, the Le Breton and his companions and his army marched to Bordelot, shown here on the map. Now at Bordelot, there was another orc horde laying siege to the town. This orc horde, not expecting an attack from the rear, was absolutely set upon by Le Breton and his allies. Under the banner of the lady now, which they were given, they all took heart and completely destroyed the sieging goblin horde. Now, it's said during that battle, the 3 Grail Knights killed as many greenskins as the rest of the army combined, to give you an idea of the kind of strength they had now as Grail Knights. So the Grail Knights met up, once they'd freed Bordelot, they met up with Marcus de Bordelot and Ferdinand d'Aquitaine, the Dukes of Aquitaine and Bordelot. And in the chapel, in a private chamber of Bordelot Castle, the lady appeared to them again and allowed Marcus and Ferdinand, the Dukes of Bordelot and Aquitaine respectively, to drink from the cups and become the 4th and 5th Grail Knights respectively. After this victory, the army grew a bit. They took on some of the men of Bordelot and some of the men of Aquitaine and marched south to Brionne. And at Brionne, they encountered a warlord called Brogstar. Now, Brogstar again had a massive horde and not expecting to any relief. Really, Bretonnia was on its last legs. That Le Breton army was expected to be wiped out by the horde that had gone north. But indeed, they surprised them and set upon them, But this horde was the biggest they'd maybe faced to date. They say each man of the Bretonnian army was outnumbered 300 to 1, and they still came out with a victory, thanks largely to the now 5 Grail Knights that were riding with them. Now, urged on by a vision from the lady, Le Breton decided to take the army east. And they marched through the lands of Carcassonne and ended up at Quesnel. Now, Quesnel is on the border of Athlone, and when they got to Quesnel, the land, like the forest, that part of the forest was burning and on fire, and the Orc horde was obviously up to some mischief in there. And many of the men of Bretonnia feared going into this part of the woods because it was known that this part of the woods was occupied by an entity known as the Fey Enchantress. Le Breton was not discouraged by this, and he told his men, let's go, and judging by the victories and the deeds they'd seen him commit, they were inspired enough to follow him into the woods, and they set upon the Orc hordes taking shelter in there. During this battle, the Fey Enchantress actually appeared out of nowhere in the middle of it, aiding the Bretonnians and allowing them to come away with yet another victory. And she joined them thereafter. So the Fey Enchantress joined the Bretonnian army and joined them on their march north. And they marched north through Paravon, and the capital city of Paravon was lying in ruin, but the Duke of Paravon joined up with Le Breton, mounting his Pegasus, aiding Le Breton in taking back Paravon from the Greenskin hordes. Now, many of the Greenskin hordes had actually poured forth from this area in the middle, you'll see here, Massif Orca. There is where they originated from. So you can see Le Breton is really just trying to sort of pin them down, make them retreat back to their own territory, and kill them there as well. So Le Breton from then moves on from Paravon to Montfort. And in Montfort, when they are charging down the Greenskin army around Montfort, Le Breton is struck by a ballista thrown from one presumably assumes was a goblin spear chucker. And it pierced Paravon, and they thought he was going to die. The remaining Grail Knights fought through the horde, hacking and cleaving their way till they got into the city walls. There, not the Fey Enchantress, the Lady of the Lake appeared anew and healed Le Breton. And having ridden out to help Le Breton, the dukes who were at Montfort, and he was granted to drink from the Grail Cup. You can kind of see where this is going. The lady seems to be collecting all the dukes as her personal servants. And there's this kind of mischievous undertone to what the lady's trying to do with Le Breton's campaign here. Yes, she's trying to rid the lands of orcs and chaos and beastmen and undead, but she's also it seems like she's looking to have the dukes of the Bretonnia tribes pledge fealty to her as well. So after this battle in Montfort, Le Breton and the rest of the Grail Knights enter the caverns of Massif Orca, and they look to slay the Goblin Kings hiding therein, who had sent all these hordes forth. Now, after I think it's a couple of days, they emerge battered and bloodied, but they'd slain every Goblin King in that area and had been victorious without losing a single of the Grail Knights. Having gone from victory to victory to victory, they continued their march north to Gisero. And at Gisero, they were greeted by an army led by numerous orc shamans. Now, they hadn't really encountered a lot of shamans in their campaign to date, but thanks to the blessings of the lady that had been placed upon the Grail Knights and the blessings that their simple auras construed among the Grail companions who were the soldiers serving with them, the magic seemed ineffectual, and the orc shamans couldn't understand why the Little War, the law of Little War or Big War wasn't having any effect, and they got run down by the Bretonnian cavalry. Now, going on from this battle, the army continues to grow, continues to pick up more members. At Gisero, this is where they pick up the Duke of Artois and the Duke of Gisero, and those two are initiated into the Grail Knight Order. From here, they march west to Mousillon. Now, in the game, Mousillon is a land of the dead, but at the time, just before these these wars had started, Mousillon was in fact one of the most beautiful places in Bretonnia. It was praised as the sort of the fairest land in the entire kingdom. Well, not kingdom then, but in the entire collective of Bretonnie dukedoms. But now it was a smouldering ruin after the wars that had taken place. In Mousillon, the Bretonnians arrive in the city and it's burnt to a crisp. But they do get word from scouts in the area and people who'd survived the onslaught in Mousillon that a joint beastman and undead horde was about to close down on them there. So they took to their saddles and their swords and armed themselves up, and each of the Grail Knights were set about the defenses, and they were set upon by a huge horde of undead and beastmen. Now, knowing the weakness of the undead, the Grail Knights each sort of attacked a dark hero of that army, as any of the strongest members of that army they could find, to cut them down and to shatter the morale. And also, because it is an undead army, they wanted to take out the necromancers. And indeed, once they took out the lead necromancer, half the undead army immediately crumbled to dust. The beastmen, seeing that their allies had been shattered, completely broke and were scattered from the battle, leading again for another victory for Le Breton and his allies. Following that victory, Le Breton marches north through the Ardennes forest to Longwy, which was during the War of the Beard, the last bastion of the elves in the Old World. So they get to Longwy, and here is where they encounter a Norscan army of Norscan tribesmen, and who are just laying siege to Longwy. Now, one of the Grail Knights, I don't think it's Le Breton himself, but one of his companions, knowing sort of the fighting nature of the Norsemen, challenges the leader to a duel. Now, this guy towers above the average man, sort of 7-foot monster, and they fight atop the lighthouse of Longwy, which is even such a landmark. It's shown on this map here. And having the strength and the blessing of the lady, of course, the Grail Knight emerges victorious. And the terms were, whomsoever loses has to withdraw their army. Now, the Norscans may be savages and lunatics who live in the northern wastes, but they are, to a certain degree, honorable. And having defeated their champion and killed him and cast him down from the top of the lighthouse, they stayed true to their word, and the entire Norscan army withdrew. Now, for the most part, at this point, Le Breton has cleared the south of the greenskins and most of the undead. Those necromancers who still alive probably flee back south to the lands of the Tomb Kings. And now all he has left is to liberate the town of Cologne. And so they march east to Cologne for the final battle to liberate Bretonnia from the armies that had been laying siege to it for a number of years. So they arrive at Cologne. There's an army of chaos monstrosities, of beastmen. And just as the sort of Cologne thought its troubles were over, it has what appear to be rat men emerging from the sewers and robbing and pillaging and murdering at will. So Le Breton's army arrives on the scene, and a battle of epic proportions takes place. The Grail Knights all charge forth. I think there's 15 of them at this point. And it is a massacre. There are casualties on both sides. But battered and bruised, the Bretonnian army emerges victorious. And that signaled the liberation of Bretonnia. And that was Le Breton's campaign to liberate Bretonnia. Now, during this campaign, at the beginning, he had been labeled the leader of battles. And so that had made him the lead general for the Bretonnian dukedoms. Now, at the end of the battle, the lady encourages them to crown Le Breton king of Bretonnia. And at this point, they're so enthralled and so amazed by the deeds they've seen and the leadership under Le Breton that they crown him the first king of Bretonnia. He ruled happily and sort of consolidated the kingdom and kept it relatively safe for the next 17 years. At some point, sort of 17 years later, he and some of his retinue are put upon by an orc ambush. and he is killed by what is only really described as a cowardly missile weapon. So we don't know whether that's a ballista or even a doom diver or just an arrow. I'm not quite sure what killed him in the end exactly. It just a missile thing, and that maybe speaks to some of the Bretonnian hatred for cowardly the use of missiles in battle, and why they only let peasants use them. So Le Breton is dead, and in his dying words, he asked to be cast upon the nearby lake on a boat. And as he is, the lady seems to appear in the mists as he floats into the center of the lake, and his body disappears. It says the lady took his body, and obviously, maybe she did, and turned him into the Green Knight as we know him today. Now, the Green Knight, in terms of his abilities when he eventually comes to Total War Warhammer, is he will be ethereal. He will probably be a very strong sort of just knightly unit. He will be mounted, and he will have his, I think it's the Dolorous Blade, which is just described as a huge sword of such immense weight and size that it sunders any armor it strikes down upon, which in the tabletop, if I remember correctly, meant that no one could make any armor saves against him. So essentially, I think all his damage maybe should be armor piercing or a very high percentage of it as an ethereal unit. But that is the story of Giles le Breton and the Green Knight, respectively, and how the lady got him to serve her throughout most of his life and in death as well, and how she really managed to ensnare the entire Bretonnian kingdom into worshipping her. I won't get into the intricacies of the sort of theories around the Lady of the Lake in this video. I just wanted to give you a bit of background on Le Breton and the Green Knight and his history. I hope you guys found this interesting. At the moment, I'll probably pop up some videos that you might also enjoy. But I hope you guys like this, and do join me, do subscribe, and do like, and do comment if you think I missed anything or there's anything in particular I may have got wrong. As I say, I'm not perfect with the lore, but I do know a thing or two. And if there's anything I got wrong, I'd be happy to hear it and correct it in the comments, and people can read through that. But otherwise, guys, thanks very much for listening, and do join me on the next one. Thanks very much.